Take it away, Tejas.
Thank you so much, Maria. Thank you for inviting me to join the YWCA celebration of Human Rights Day this year. My name is Tejas Sanchala. I'm the Executive Director for the Westchester County Human Rights Commission. My pronouns are he, him, his. And this year, Human Rights Day celebrates the 73rd anniversary of the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights with the theme of equality, reducing inequality and advancing human rights. Maria's asked me to speak briefly about the Commission's work and effort to advance human rights in Westchester County. For those who do not know, the Westchester County Human Rights Commission has been serving the public for 21 years, combating hate and discrimination in all of their forms, and by bringing together the diverse people of our county. The Commission's mission is twofold. First, we enforce the county's human rights law and fair housing law. These laws prohibit discrimination based on 17 protected categories in the areas of housing, employment, places of public accommodations, and credit lending. The county's laws were visionary, protecting against discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, protections that were only added to the federal civil rights law last year. We are very fortunate to have such a strong supporter in our county executive. The county executive was instrumental in the creation of the agency when he was a legislator in 1999, along with then legislators Andrea Stewart Cousins and the late great Lois Bronze. The county continues to strengthen these laws. Earlier this year, the Fair Housing Law was amended to require cooperative housing corporations to provide rejected applicants with a written reason. This provision is intended to provide greater transparency during the purchase process. A recent study in nearby Long Island showed that approximately 50% of African-American testers were racially steered away from one neighborhood and towards certain other neighborhoods. That study was from 2019, not from 1968. Sadly, housing discrimination is alive and remains rampant today. And just this week, the human rights law was amended to provide individuals in Westchester County with the viable avenue of justice to fight back against instances of hate when they're attacked or intentionally harmed because of their race, gender, religion, or any of the 16 protected categories under the county's human rights law. In general, this provision can protect against incidents involving street harassment, neighbor-on-neighbor harassment, to name just two. So in this manner, the county's law goes beyond the protections offered under the state's human rights law. These strengthened laws will allow the commission to play a greater role in assisting our community. In addition to accepting, investigating, and adjudicating complaints of discrimination, the commission also engages in a robust education and outreach campaign to combat hate, discrimination, and to connect the community and its leaders with resources. After the murder of George Floyd, the commission launched an education and empowerment series to combat racism and hate. We hosted multiple bystander intervention training workshops to help provide the community with tools and how we can all be upstanders and stop hate and harassment when we see it. We organized a solidarity building workshop to build bridges and develop unity. That workshop was specifically designed to combat the false media narrative regarding the attacks against Asian Americans. We held a program with Reverend Dr. Bryant T. Marks on building allyship, and he talked about how we can be allies from one community to another, how a minority community can be an ally to a majority community and vice versa, and how you can be allies within one community to address issues of racism and hate. We also had a program on combating hate against the Asian American community. I was proud to speak at the YWCA Stand Against Racism event in 2020. Our deputy director spoke at the Stand Against Racism event that the YWCA hosted at Pace University back when we met in person in 2019. And that's a really quick snapshot. We've done more than 10 programs in our education empowerment series. Next week, we will release our next program. It's our virtual Human Rights Day event, and that will feature a conversation with award-winning journalist and television show host Celeste Headley on how to have those hard conversations about race with your family, friends, and neighbors. Ms. Headley is the author of a fantastic new book. It's called Speaking of Race, Why Everybody Needs to Talk About Racism and How to Do It. The program will also include remarks by New York State Senate Majority Leader Andrea Stewart Cousins, the county executive, George Latimer, the commission's chair, Reverend Dalton, and Reverend Dr. Stephen Pogue. I hope you'll all be able to join us for that virtual program. And with that, I'd like to congratulate Maria and the whole team at the YWCA for this exciting Human Rights Day program. I look forward to hearing and learning from this dynamic panel. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you so much for those remarks. And I'd love to start with Asha, Castleberry-Hernandez, Westchester's own. If you could introduce yourself to us by just telling us how your commitment to human rights has influenced your life and also impacted the values you live out every day.
Yes, thank you, Maria, and thank you, everyone. I'm so happy to join this lovely panel on Human Rights Day. So I'm just excited to share my point of view. Well, this question is interesting because it makes you kind of step back about thinking about your life on your decision making and looking at your values. And I would say that what has shaped my values is, as a woman of color, actually experiencing some of the disadvantages when it comes to human rights, whether it's socio, economics, and political. And that is what has drove me to work in government, whether as a military officer, which some of you guys are probably surprised to hear, because most don't associate the military with human rights, but there is an association. Many people do join the military to support, defend human rights abroad. So that was one. Also in government, I work at the State Department, and we do tons and tons of work when it comes to defending human rights abroad at the UN and many other places, working with our allies and partners. So because I believe in human rights, it's a pleasure to work for the State Department that does that kind of work. So, and also been part of several organizations that defend progressive values that is reflective of many human rights that I believe in. But going back to what are the values that have shaped me, I would say that one thing I will say that I'm very passionate about is political and economic justice. In the county I ran for office about 2 years ago, and one value that drove me is to make sure that we achieve economic equality, especially for communities of color, where I felt that there was a lot of disadvantages there. So, and then as a family that comes from descendant of slaves, where slavery has robbed us in terms of economic justice, that is something that drove me to want to run for office. And now I would say, looking at institutions like the UN, where they're defending to address those issues, is a treat to watch in the 21st century. So, it comes from experiences, the background you come from, and also the current work you're doing. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Asha. Let's move on to Guerline. Guerline Jozef, if you can tell us just a little bit about how human rights, that principle, that body of work, really influences your work and impacts how you live out your values.
Thank you so much, Maria, for putting this amazing panel together. And thank you, Tashish, for setting up the stage or the table for all of us to be able to share. Human rights for us, as an immigrant, a Haitian woman, American woman, Haitian American woman, a Black immigrant, descendant of enslaved people in the Americas, we're looking into how human rights impact us, right? And what does that mean for people who are still in search of safety, people who are in search of freedom, people who are really looking for to be respected, to be welcomed with dignity. So human rights really on this day forces me specifically to look at the basic human reality of how somebody must be protected, to have the freedom to just be who they are, who they choose to be, but to also be cared for and loved and appreciated. So really, in our continued fight for human rights, include human dignity, no matter where they are born, no matter where they are from, no matter what their backgrounds are.
Thank you so much, Guerline. Same question to you, Bilal.
Thank you, Maria.
Hi.
I really appreciate being granted
I was
this
on
opportunity.
trying to get on a video thing. at the
I think
Y,
if you're
and I
not
think I've
muted,
just
you
gotten
should
off of it.
just
Oh no,
double
here it
check
is.
that you're muted.
I just can't hear them. I don't want to be seen or
I'm sorry,
heard,
someone
but I
is
can't
speaking
hear
and
them.
can't hear us. I'm sorry. I am looking for who that person is and will mute. Thank you. Continue, Bilal.
Yeah, so thank you, Maria.
Can
Human
you see
rights
it?
for me, I'm gonna lean in
Oh.
closer just because I think my volume's a little low. So I was born in Afghanistan and came to the United States when I was a 5-year-old with my family. We were fleeing the war.
Go look at. Let me show me your lower left corner. Okay.
Okay.
Keep going. Yep.
And that early memory of leaving our country and seeking safety kind of has never left me in the work that I do, for the Welcome with Dignity campaign, or just being involved in the human rights movement. I believe fundamentally that if we are going to take seriously that all people are created equal, that we should all have the equal chance to seek safety, to be treated with dignity when we need help, and it also goes back to just like the deep cultural wisdom of my homeland. That we have one of our most famous poets in Persian, Sadi, famously said that all human beings are part of one body. If one limb hurts, the rest of the body can't be at ease, and that it's something that has stuck with me since I was a child, and so that's why I'm here today.
Thank you so much, Bilal. Mintu fam, please share with us how human rights impacts your life, your work, and the values you live out every day.
Thanks so much, Maria, and thanks for asking me to be part of this amazing panel, and thanks to you all for joining. So like Bilal, I was not born here. I was born in Vietnam, and my family left as refugees right after the war. We fled by boat, came to a refugee camp in Indonesia, and we were there for about 8 months. And then we were very lucky to be resettled in the United States. And the sense of the risk that my parents took to flee, to find security, freedom, and better opportunity has really just stayed with me for my entire life. And, really they were looking for something that we all want, which is security, and freedom, and essentially human dignity, and being able to have the opportunity to live the way that we do here. And that sense of gratitude has really stuck with me. In the UN Charter, the preamble has the phrase "a better standards of life and larger freedom," and that I think is really a theme that we all are striving for. My former boss, Kofi Annan, I was very lucky to be a strategic planning advisor for him, named one of his seminal reports in Larger Freedom to try to get at how do we improve the ability of the UN to help provide this sense of security and freedom to everyone around the world. And that's really kind of been a defining sort of feature or principle that I've built my career and my life around. I've worked for the last almost 20 years on human rights, refugee issues. In fact, Bilal, I worked for the Women's Commission for Refugee Women and Children, the former name of it, after college. So really great to see you here. I worked in Bosnia and Ethiopia on refugee issues, on peace building, on trying to bring societies together, and more recently working to help create the Sustainable Development Goals, which is a set of goals that all 193 countries around the UN have agreed on to end extreme poverty, tackle inequality, which obviously is tearing apart our societies, and really trying to curb climate change by 2030. More recently, I've been working on trying to strengthen and improve our democracy. It's kind of no coincidence that today on Human Rights Day, President Biden is also holding his Summit for Democracy. And it's really encouraging to see, because not only do we need to strengthen and revive democracy globally. But obviously this comes at a time when this country is being torn apart at the seams, in part because of historical issues around race and justice that we've seen play out over the last few years, and kind of a racial reckoning that has been really just way too long coming. But also, I think because there's a sort of crisis of political polarization in this country, and so I think all of that connects to what we know we need to do in terms of human rights. And I've tried to do as much as I can in my career, and I'm really grateful to be part of this conversation. We need to do that not only at the global level on the 73rd anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but really it happens at the local level, which is why I think, it's just so grateful to you, Maria, for pulling together this conversation, because if we don't do it here at home in our communities, we're not going to be able to do that globally. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mintu. And our last panelist here, Nicolaine Lazarre, joining us live and direct from Haiti. So Nicolaine, please, the question we're all responding to, the prompt, is to just share how human rights has impacted our lives, our work, so your work, your life, and the values that you hold.
The Bill of Rights says exactly, it's the ability to have unfettered the pursuit of happiness without artificial barriers. And I think that we have a lot of societies, even highly evolved and Western societies, highly developed societies, where those barriers are enacted on the basis of one's race or appearance or sexual preference or gender. And that persists to this day. The other issue, I think, and again, I bring back this notion of equal access, is when you have those artificial barriers, it actually hurts society as a whole, because you lose a lot of potential, you lose a lot of talent, you lose a lot of the world's problem solvers to really artificial and important barriers. So that's what the human rights means to me. It's both an obligation and a calling on a personal level. And it also, to me, stands for the factor that everyone should be able to pursue their full potential without the barriers erected by the powerful, without barriers based on what they look like, who they love, what their gender is. And everyone has within them the ability to solve humanity's greatest problems if we can get beyond those challenges that divide us as a human race.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Not only is your commitment to human rights evident as both obligation and calling, but just want to take a point of personal privilege. Your commitment to me as a friend, making it here for this panel, knowing you had to travel to Haiti today, is personally appreciated. And thank you for your thoughts and your feedback about that. I'm thinking right now very strongly about artificial barriers that get in the way of us reaching our full potential. And I'm going to hold that while I turn it back to Asha. Because as you were introducing yourself, Asha, you talked about joining the State Department, going into government service because you have this commitment to human rights. And another friend who has come through here in the clutch for me, Asha, I just want to say out loud, you do not represent the entire United States government throughout all of its history and its future actions. However, in your current position, and from your personal experience, right, explicitly, how is it representing the United States on a global stage with these conversations about human rights and access to freedom and liberty and these values that we uphold here, but we know that we ourselves here struggle to realize. So if you could talk a bit about the US's role and responsibility as you see it, and how you approach your work as you are committed to human rights and seeing that there are crises and humanitarian issues here and abroad.
Thank you, and thank you for putting out the disclaimer. Yes, my views and do not represent the entire United States government, although I am with the State Department, and I'm also a major in the Army Reserve, so DOD and state. I will tell you, no democracy is perfect. We know that, but the whole goal is to strive to improve our democracy, not reverse. And that's something that you have to look at when it comes to the United States. We're striving to do better. There's times where we have messed up, but the focus on leaning forward is what I would say is very important. And just working at State Department, the one thing I do see where they're striving to be better is defending democracy on a consistent basis, especially on the world stage at the United Nations. Just as mentioned before, today is the Summit for Democracy. It's a huge summit where we're engaging with our partners and allies on how to restore at international rule-based order those principles. And one of the major principles is human rights. But beyond the Summit for Democracy, State Department is always engaged at the Security Council and several other places defending human rights. And I will tell you, we are in a world right now where that is more contested as far as defending human rights. The United States is engaged with calling out the word G, what we say, or genocide when it's necessary, trying to mobilize the community behind acts against people when it comes to mass executions. So the United States does remain engaged on a consistent basis, of restoring human rights. But again, it's not an easy job. People will judge you based on your history, but the whole point is to strengthen our democracy as much as possible. It could be a messy process. It could come off hypocritical, but at the end of the day, the whole point, the strategic goal is to make sure that we're striving for to strengthen our democracy when it comes to supporting our human rights work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Asha. And I mean, kicked it off what I think what could be the fairest opening statement, right? No democracy is perfect. We're creating this as we live through it. And so thank you for that response. I want to engage both Guerline and Bilal, because one of the things that were the impetus for us putting together this panel was looking at the situation in Afghanistan and looking at the situation in Haiti, both in our current moment and also like the histories that have led us to our current moments. And so Guerline, we'll start with you and then go to Bilal. Can you give us a sense based on your work that you're doing right now? You can't give us the whole history. I'm going to send out some links that will help people understand the context, but give us a sense of what's going on the ground in Haiti right now and how this humanitarian crisis could be addressed in a more holistic and maybe successful way.
Thank you so much, Asha, Maria, but I wanted to piggyback on something Asha mentioned and really highlight how U.S. policies affect other countries. And in the case of Haiti, we can look into 200 plus history of U.S. intervention, U.S. policies, U.S. mingling, creating a condition that makes Haiti unlivable for the people on the ground and pushing people out of the country, making the journey. And we saw result of that in Del Rio in September. And also want to highlight, as I am speaking to you today, the United States have deported over 9,300 of the people we saw under the bridge being whipped by men in uniform, CBP officers in uniform, whipping Haitians who came to the US-Mexico border to ask for asylum, to ask for protection, people who were forced to leave Haiti partly due to US policy and US interventions in Haiti's affair. But I think Nicole, who is in Haiti, can speak more about the state of the country right now. But we know that in July, assassination of the president, that was a result of a year of unrest, extreme violence, kidnappings and killing of people within the civil society, and also extreme political turmoil, followed by an earthquake and a storm, and continued uprising in the country due to many other unfortunate, both man-made and natural disasters. And as we look into human rights, and we are standing against both internal violence that is, of course, part of what people are dealing with, but also external violence that are the forces outside of the country that are creating the system that we see in Haiti. And then we will talk about, Bilal will talk about Afghanistan. But the reality is, when we take a step back to really look into how migration and border, right? And I think it was Nicole who also mentioned artificial borders. And we understand clearly that the people who have means, if you are rich and you are influential and you have the means, there is no border for you. But if you are running for your lives in need of protection, in need of support, then there is this artificial border that are created to keep the most vulnerable from getting protection, from really fully have a life that is protected, as we talk about in the concept of human rights. On the ground in Haiti right now, as I mentioned, continuous political turmoil. We do not have a working government. We do not have a president. We have a government that has been put in place by the international community that is not in the best interest of the people on the ground. And now we have migrants who have been forced to flee and being pushed away and being deported and not being treated with dignity. No human right being provided to care for those people. So we are at a very critical time, specifically today as we celebrate the idea of human right. But from what we have seen, let's say the past few years, and definitely the past 6 months, human rights have not been observed when it comes to the most vulnerable, the people who are really in need. As Bilal mentioned, if we are a body, right, and if I am suffering, there must be a way for us to come together to answer to our humanity in a way that people will be dignified. The pursuit of happiness, the reality that we all are in this world together, to be sure that you and I are protected. There is no me without you. I was in the Rio under the bridge. And when I was there as a Black immigrant, a Haitian American woman, and I will repeat, descendant of enslaved people in America, I was looking at 14,000 people that I could have been in their place. So I was looking at myself, looking back at myself, and I cannot tell you how painful that reality was and continues to be as the United States refuses to respect human rights at the US-Mexican border right now.
Thank you, Guerline. Thank you so much, and even for bringing up your own experience at the border there. So often in these panels, people come and share an expertise, a lived experience, and we don't acknowledge the potential for reliving the mental anguish and the emotional labor there. So I just really, for you and for all who are going to a place where you're being vulnerable and courageous with us, thank you. Thank you so much. Bilal, as we think about Afghanistan, and so as I turn to you, I'm remembering I ran into someone who was born in 1999 this week. And I not in the moment we saw each other, because this is not front of mind for me, but as I came back to prepare for this panel, I said, oh my goodness, the entirety of this person's life, the United States there's been this situation in Afghanistan. So, sometimes the time feels like not something we're tracking well, but if you could think of think about and tell us what is going on in Afghanistan. How have we come to this moment where we see refugees coming to our country? We don't have forever. I wish we did, but we will share resources after for folks to understand historical context if this is new for them. But please do share your understanding of what is going on and what is the level of human rights that we feel
Sure.
we're experiencing with these the Afghan situation.
Are you able to hear me better now?
Much better, thank you.
Great. So yes, I think as you rightfully mentioned, the United States has been involved in Afghanistan for a long time, but let's not take such a U.S.-centric view on this today, right? Let's think about it as an Afghan person. Perhaps you're an Afghan woman with some children. There has been war in Afghanistan since 1975. So anyone who's under 40 in Afghanistan hasn't known a single day of peace. And let's name who were the main actors in that war. It was the Soviet Union and the United States using Afghanistan as a playground to act out their military conflict, right? Billions of dollars came into Afghanistan from the CIA, funding textbooks that instead of saying, A is for apple, B is for boat, it said A is for Allah, J is for jihad. Those were CIA funded textbooks that people have written about to kind of further the animosities in Afghanistan that were contained before. And what has happened since? It's particularly ironic and poignant when we talk about human rights in Afghanistan, because you may remember that after 2001, one of the main messages about the war in Afghanistan is we're going in there to fight for human rights. We're going to go in there and fight for women's rights. Women's rights in Afghanistan are not being respected today and weren't respected during the US presence up until a few months ago. And so it's difficult when we talk about human rights being used as a justification for these wars. And what are we talking about today here in the United States? As Guerline mentioned, borders exist for certain people. But if we're going to talk about, if human rights are to be human rights, they need to be universal. And so a wealthy family, a wealthy white family needs to be treated the same way that, or an Afghan family should be treated the same way that a wealthy family should be treated. We have seen, despite the administration's promises, an increase in denials for humanitarian parole for Afghans. We have seen conservative estimates by the Evacuate Our Allies Coalition, which is a coalition of former veterans who are fighting to get their partners here to the United States. Their conservative estimate is that there are 100,000 people who would qualify for refugee status in the United States left in Afghanistan. And the less conservative estimate is that it's up to 1 million, right? And so the fundamental human right to be safe and seek safety isn't being protected. And we need to do better as Americans and as citizens of this republic to fight for that. Otherwise, we're just paying lip service to human rights.
Wow, thank you so much, Bilal. And at this moment, giving myself a self-time check, I want to make sure that folks know if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat as we get closer and closer to our Q&A time. But this is one of my favorite things to do when there's a panel, especially one this large with so many different perspectives and experiences, is I want to quiet myself because I too am excited to learn and hear. And as we get into this next section, for both the panelists, of course, we've discussed this, but for those of us who have the privilege of watching this dialogue unfold, one of the things I do in my work around anti-racism is remind myself all the time that there are many truths, right? There are many truths, and my feelings are not necessarily the facts of the entire situation. And so one of the practices that comes out of that as one of my anti-racist practices for myself is to sit in discomfort and to sit in the intersection of my own personal discomfort and also hold space for someone else to be uncomfortable without trying to fix them or make them feel better. This is a moment where we're going to let our panelists ask of one another some questions based on what they've heard, based on what they know. This is a really exciting thing for us who are not experts to get to hear the experts have this conversation. And another thing I want to add as a value of the Center for Racial Equity that will show up in this in this conversation is a commitment to the truth. Knowing that there could be various perspectives on a truth or on several truths, we know that holding as our highest value that we come into this conversation with one another, wanting to be true and wanting to believe the truth that is offered to us, that we're gonna watch our experience, our panelists talk to one another. I'm gonna figure out how to re-add Nicole to the spotlight, but at the very least, I can unmute Nicole, who has so much to offer to the conversation as well. There are some questions I appreciate. Moments, we're just gonna let our panelists unmute and talk to one another, and let this moment be discomfort. It will be truths, but I believe even in this virtual setting, we can hold the container to let this happen and know that we're not going to, in the next 15 to 20 minutes, come to any definitive solutions that will immediately change the situations that we've been hearing about and are witnessing in our world, but that through our conversation together, we as a group here, the 56 of us on this, our bodies resonate with ways that we can take on personal practices that empower and amplify human rights in West, in fact, one day, the globe. So if our panelists, I'm gonna let y'all just do it. I believe that I don't need to say anything else for the next 15
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Maria. I don't know if you can hear me, but there are a lot of noise. I'm not sure if it's probably from Nicole.
It's from Nicole. So Nicole, if you can let me know when you want to jump in, thank you. Just let me know and just unmute whenever. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That this is really great, the way you are having us talk to one another. And I like to kind of talk to Asha briefly, if it's okay. And thank you so much for being here and for the work that you do, understanding the reality of how U.S. policies and the military in the case of Afghanistan and also in Haiti with the occupations 100 years ago, and we still see the impact and the aftermath today. In your work, how do you step into the space to really make sure that human rights, are respected, and how can we work together to ensure moving forward that whenever there is this type of interaction, that at the end of the day, the dignity and the rights of people are respected. And I know it might be very hard, but in your capacity, can you continue to be an advocate in those spaces for folks who are underrepresented, for folks who are abused, for the, let's say, the 9,300 people who have been disappeared, deported, that are witnesses of the abuse that we saw in Del Rio, and also victims of what we saw and experienced?
Well, the one thing I am witnessing is that people like you that are advocates are engaged with the government to provide feedback, and that is helping to sharpen policies to make it better, because the best perspective is those that are the receivers of bad policies, bad decision makings. And in some cases, most people, the government may not know everything on how these decisions can badly impact people. So the best thing is not to disengage, be engaged with government to give feedback on, hey, this decision has led to this. So with the Haiti issue, which was disappointing as far as the border issue, that was delivered to government, and automatically the VP called it out and condemned what they were doing as far as the cross-bordering issues involving the whippings. Because right away that was told, as far as that, the depictions of graphics on TV, and as well as bad feedback from the people saying this is not right. So automatically they condemned it in looking into how to prevent those future things from happening. Same thing with Afghanistan. A perfect message that came out from the other panelists is that how veteran organizations are actively involved in this process. And we have that going on right now, where there is a partnership with the government, as well as with those VSOs, those veteran service organizations that know Afghanistan really well, on how we can gel those efforts and work really hard to address what's going on in Afghanistan. So that partnership with government, staying engaged, is critical and it's key. And I'm here for you guys to reach out. If there's someone you want to reach out to help critique the process moving forward.
Let me just tack on to what Asha just said. The question you asked, Guerline, is so important, and Bilal, your perspective, so critically important. So, part of the reason why I've essentially in my 20-year career got involved in foreign policy was because I saw the way that those foreign policy decisions played out in the country that, my parents call home. My mother was a refugee twice, first after the French were defeated, moved south when she was 2. And then again, of course, after, the war ended and my father was put in re-education camp. And then, seeing, my family, we were all together in Florida on vacation in August. And as we saw town after town in Afghanistan falling, literally our family would gather around the TV and say, just gasping at the devastation. It's essentially reliving the worst days of our lives by looking at what was going on in Afghanistan. And, as Vietnamese Americans, all of us have family roots in another country, whether that was 300 years ago or yesterday. And I think, just the desire for a better life, the desire for security and freedom is something that we all have. And when my family saw those scenes in Afghanistan, we said, oh my God, we have to do something. It's happening again. The scenes of people flocking to the airport. My uncle immediately sat down. He couldn't stand, took off his glasses, started crying, and, told us all the story of, him rushing to the American embassy and trying to get his family out in April of 1975, and thinking, 46 years later, how are we now reliving some of this? And so essentially, I'm on the board of a Vietnamese American organization. We then did everything we could to rally the Vietnamese community and anybody, to support, refugee organizations that were resettling, organizations that were providing humanitarian assistance on the ground, and then appealing to members of Congress and policymakers to try to do everything they possibly could to process and get as many Afghans to safety as possible, providing a humanitarian corridor, all the rest of it. But just to say that to Asha's, question, answer here, I think that's exactly right, is that the real asset of this country is our rich diversity and our immigrant heritage. We are all immigrants, unless you're Native American and indigenous to this country, whether we chose to come here as an immigrant or you were forced here from slavery, but we all have ties to other countries, and we know what it means to flee for our lives and to want to come and create a better life for ourselves. And that lived experience, whether you personally lived it or your family did, should inform how you think about what we see in the news and what our policies are and how we approach human rights. And when we take that perspective, I think we can all It means acting, it means picking up the phone, it means voting, it means actually being engaged in our community, and the great leaders on this call who are pulling folks together to try to do something. But it means really taking that and doing something with it so that we can press for better policies and better ideas. And by the way, it's not just policies. So policies are what we should be doing. What is the right answer? But part of that right answer is, what does our politics, what is our democracy, what can our democracy bear? We know that there are people who in this country who may fundamentally believe in human rights, but they have a vastly different point of view than we do. I grew up in Tennessee and North Carolina, where many communities are saying, look at all of these illegal immigrants coming in, we have to stop them. They have a very different point of view, even if they fundamentally believe in some of the same principles that we do. So how do we make sure that it's easier for our policymakers who may be driven by human rights but have very difficult choices to make, when so much of our electorate says to them, we don't want those people here, we have to take a law and order approach, or whatever the case may be? How do we reach out to those folks? It's not just demanding our policymakers to do the right thing. They may want to do the right thing, but the pressure's on them. There's a very real chance that some of the policymakers that we want to be in office are not going to be in office again because, the forces are against them. And so how do we sort of reach out to those other folks coming from the values perspective that we have to really try to build those bridges? Because the political polarization is pulling this country apart. And no matter how much you want our policymakers to make certain decisions, it's very, very difficult for them when the polity doesn't actually believe in that, or that it's so divided that we can't actually get to those answers.
Very quickly, just to go on that, I think misinformation has played a big role in everything. And even the language, the narrative, when you say illegal immigrants and not understanding what asylum is, you grew up in Tennessee, how many people really understand that asylum is a legal thing for people to do? It is legal for people both under international and US law for somebody to come to the US-Mexico border or to come into here and ask for asylum. That is the legal thing for them to do. So I think outreach and education plays a big role in all of that. How do we educate, right, hardly in America, so that when they just hear a propaganda, they don't fall into the trap of division and hatred, but for them to really understand the very basic reality that these are the right things, this is how it's supposed to be, and how can we create a space, a system, an environment where people from Afghanistan are treated the same way as people from Haiti, right? And we talked about how the president, the vice president came out and they said they condemned the whole thing that they saw. And the next day, those same victims were deported. So in one hand, we are saying, oh, this is horrible. And in the background, we are putting more hurt and pain into the same thing we just say we condemned, right? But how do we make sure when we have a balanced a narrative that is based on truth that people can understand, then we can move forward?
Absolutely, Guerline. I think there's no more fundamental human right than to being safe and seeking safety. And so, we can talk about the right to freedom of speech or freedom of religion, but if you're not safe, it doesn't do much. And I want to talk specifically, Mintu, to what the Vietnamese American community did for the Afghan community. We saw it and we appreciate it, and it's so loved. I think it's one of the things that gives me hope here as an American, is that these different communities came together to support each other. I saw, there was a benefit concert from Vietnamese American pop stars that raised money, and it warmed my heart. And so those are the times that we can really lean in and say, draw on our personal experience and really fight for the human rights of others.
And here, I just want to make sure, since she's not spotlighted, Nicole, if you wanted to come off mute and add anything or ask anything, I want to make sure you're not left out there from our technical restrictions here. All right, so we'll always make space if Nicole can jump back in, understanding again, she's live at Port-au-Prince, just landed this morning. So, you know, we have some questions from the audience, which I think I'll go to first. Oh, there's Nicole.
Never mind, I was on mute. We can just move forward. I'm so sorry. I was speaking. Well, just briefly, that I do agree that we have to move on beyond tribalism and ignorance and fear. I know what my ministry is, and my ministry is social impact and social entrepreneurship, which I believe helps to counter the destabilization of democracy and peace and prosperity in those countries that people are trying to flee, up to a certain point, right? You can only get so far. Once it's been completely destabilized by sometimes outside influences like the CIA, I think you get to a point where you can't do anything. But my spot and my space is in the side of coming up with solutions. But I do agree with Guerline and Bilal that there has to be a messaging campaign. There has to be a tactical approach to how the United States handles these situations, and part of it is directly addressing the demographic that has that fear and ignorance and tribalism. I was very upset about what was happening. Really, I go back to Myanmar when I saw the assassination of a 17-year-old, and you know, the violence that was happening, religious violence, to Afghanistan, and being very clear that the way that things were moving, it was going to be very dangerous for women, for people that had helped the United States all the time during the occupation. So it was very clear to me that there was no question, no hesitation needed to help. And when it came to Haiti, was shocked to find the messaging being very different, it being viewed as a problem, and actually using the concept of disease and violence to refer to immigrants that were fleeing, you know, poverty and fleeing war and fleeing instability in their country. So I do think that there has to be some messaging, some hearts and minds campaigns to counter and buffer the narrative that, you know, we have others and outsiders that should not be in the country for whatever reason.
Thank you so much, Nicole. You know, what you're saying really, this whole conversation really is bringing to light for me this mingling, this coexistence of both human rights principles and values being uplifted, and where I find myself doing work, right? Like this commitment to anti-racism, right? And where those two things intersect and how they play out. We see it in the way that these two crises are being discussed, the ways refugees, humans are being talked about. We also see it as we continue to navigate our lives through this global pandemic, right? How is this talked about? Last year, you know, we had this, and I don't even like using this language, but it was this Wuhan disease, right? And now that the Omicron variant has been reported by South Africa because they were professional enough to share their amazing research and findings, that now we see, and maybe here in the US we don't see it as much, but I'm hearing from friends in Europe, especially in Spain, that there are these cartoons and caricatures of dark-skinned folks being, you know, being shown as this is the disease, this is where the disease comes from. And what I'm sitting with is this compounding othering to the point of devaluation, right? Of like, if you are poor, there is something inherently defective about you. If you are Black or dark skinned, there is something inherently defective about you because of this normalization, right? Of what we think exists in this false hierarchy of human value. And, you know, as you're talking about your lane and social impact, I cannot be more excited to bring these questions up to our panelists in my lane as, you know, director of the Center for Racial Equity at the YWCA, because this is the work. I am going to jettison this false hierarchy of human value, this idea that because I live in, you know, I'm from Hartsdale, you're from Mount Vernon, I'm better than you. That's a local thing. Y'all might not get that, Guerline, Bilal, Mintu. I'll bring you back around on that on the back end. You know, this idea that, you know, I live in public housing and I own my McMansion, I'm better than you. And we just set up, again, to the point in the beginning about, and I think Henry Chapman, who's a colleague, co-CEO currently at the YWCA, asked the question at the top, you know, are there really barriers that are artificial? And I feel like on one hand, social class, race, like we made these things up, they kind of are artificial. However, the ways they show up and impact our lives are very real and very harmful, and actually rob us of our ability to exist in humanity. When Bilal talked about the impact of seeing Pivot, Mintu's and that organization of Vietnamese Americans coming together to support another community, when he saw the human connection, that was powerful, it was valuable, it was a strength, it was an asset. And yet we have these, you know, artificial, quote unquote, barriers that rob us of that experience every single day. And one of the things I'm looking to do at the center moving forward is starting with ourselves, addressing and reflecting on those artificial barriers we carry in ourselves, and how we then let that manifest in the way we interact with one another, person to person, organization to organization, group of people to group of people, institution to institution. We have to break these things down, get to our truths of who we are and how interconnected we are to one another. And until we do that, all of this work about, I read How to Be an Anti-Racist and I signed up and took the Human Rights Pledge, what does that really mean, right? What does that really mean when crises at a global level continue to happen? And in our own county, right, we have so many racist actions still going on and so many human rights violations that we don't count because they're hard to look at. And we can admit that. We can admit it's hard, but that doesn't mean it's not addressable. Day by day, take the small step.
George Floyd actually brought the United States face to face to itself last year. And unfortunately, we have very short span of memory. And we continue to repeat history and continue to do that because anti-Black racism specifically is the root of the system upon which we live in. It doesn't matter which country, right? You go to Colombia, there is anti-Black racism for when it comes to the Afro-Colombians. And you go, it doesn't matter, right? There's the Garifuna people in Honduras, there is the anti-Black racism. In the United States, we all know what it is. And then we go into colorism and into all of those things that Maria, you just mentioned, that have been created to divide us instead of unite us so that we can be a stronger community. And really understanding that, yes, anti-Black racism, not just the prejudice, but real anti-Black racism is rooted. The system is rooted in anti-Black racism. So if we just even want to look at the immigration prison system as we know it today, was built for Haitian refugees coming to the United States in the 1970s, 1980s, as opposed to the welcoming of the lighter shade Cuban, brothers and sisters, but the darker shade Haitians were not welcome and continues to be unwelcome. The anti-Black racism is at the root of all the issues that we are talking about. That's why it is critical for people to not check my I stand with George Floyd black box and keep on moving thinking I have done my part, but to really continue to look at ourselves in the mirror and do the work internally from me, from you, from our family, our organization, our community to really change the system around.
Mintu, I see you have something. Yeah.
Yeah, I think at the heart of this is kind of two things. One is to be seen and to be seen as and to belong, right? Like, part of what's been so hopefully enlightening for people is that for all of, it's not as if what happened to George Floyd was the first time, thank goodness it was videoed and all of that, right? Because otherwise, in a way, we just had to sit with that and see it in such a horrific, it took me months to watch that because I knew I couldn't, and I didn't need to, but I think for a lot of people they did. And I think being seen is something that every individual wants to have. You want to be humanized, you want to have your human dignity be valued. And that is something that hopefully is a lesson here. And for all of the arguments we've had over anti-racism and the ridiculous stuff around critical race theory, at the heart of this is a simple acknowledgement that this exists, I exist, I want to be treated in a certain way. Prioritize that before we can move on to then bringing this society together. And I think when I talk to people who are skeptical of that, they basically say the same thing. They feel like the elite coasts are looking down on them, thinking they're a bunch of idiots who just love guns and religion, and they don't feel like they've been humanized. And I'm not saying that to excuse that. I'm trying to just, it is a fundamental, what is human rights at the end of the day? It's having your human dignity respected and acknowledged. And so how do we sort of bring that when we want to our conversations about anti-racism? Maria, the questions and the values that you just talked about are so critical. How do we make sure that when we're having these conversations, people don't feel like they have to, that we, if they're kind of partly along the journey, they recognize that racism exists, they recognize that these are fundamental problems. How do we sort of bring them so that they're fully aware of this, right? Sometimes what I'm sensing is that people hear something and then automatically it's like, well, wait, are you attacking me? And then they run in the other direction. And I think if we want at the end of the day, is to sort of have people, it's like peeling an onion, right? Take the layers off so that then at the end of it, we all see that actually, I just want you to recognize my humanity and see that, there are these barriers there. Let's all attack those things together, but let's just get to the core of this. I just, so much of that has to happen at the local level. And it's not just finding people who are similar to you and, but also then what's that next step? What's that bridge to kind of get there? Because I keep hearing these conversations in some of the same circles. And I want to just expand. People were surprised that Vietnamese Americans stepped up for Afghans. And I thought, what are you talking? We have no other choice. It's not just paying it forward. It's our deep responsibility because we got here and, oh my God, this is happening again. And it could have been us again, and in fact, so that to me wasn't surprising. It was just, how is it even surprising? We have to find those bridges and be able to connect with others. When I see what's happening in Haiti, this has been, so many decades. You look just across the border at the Dominican Republic and it's a completely different, so there is something there in terms of what our policies have done. but how do we sort of reach out and really make that happen? And I think part of it is, who do we need to convince? Who's on our side already? Who's not? Who's on the fence? And how do we sort of bring them over?
Thank you so much, Mintu, Bilal, Guerline, Nicole. I think Asha had to drop, so I'm sharing some acknowledgement for Asha as well. She got called away, but I want to definitely make sure we have time for, I saw two great questions that I want to lift. Anyone can respond to them. What can we do to help people seeking asylum, aside from I think what we tell a lot of people, just vote. So other than voting, what can we do to help people who are seeking asylum?
I think Guerline can jump in here too, but this is what my daily work is with the Welcome with Dignity campaign. We are the asylum campaign. And so we are fighting for that human right to seek protection and seek safety. I dropped the link in the chat for people to join our campaign by signing the pledge and continuing to plug in.
I can add, it has been such a blessing working with Bilal. And when the crisis arose, we quickly came together and see how can the Haitian community and the Afghan community work together to make sure that all people are welcome with dignity. Because we can see how the folks from Afghanistan are being received, and we can see the reality of Haitians dealing with the same issues. And yet you can also see the anti-Black racism even in the way that we are receiving our brothers and sisters from Afghanistan versus our brothers and sisters from Haiti. How do we make sure that the Vietnamese American community, the Afghanistan American community, the Haitian American community, the really people of African descent and all of us come together to respond to human rights in a very simple, basic way, and make sure that all people, whether they're from Vietnam, Afghanistan, Haiti, or all at the same level, all with dignity, and really breaking the barriers that have been imposed on our bodies, our minds, and our persons.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna move on to the next question from our audience, which is if anyone can talk to how human trafficking could play into these things that we're discussing. Anyone, I see Bilal nodding, want to take a stab at that, bring that into the conversation. And Nicole has to leave us. So goodbye, Nicole. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nicole. I think Mintu, I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on human trafficking. Obviously, human trafficking is modern day slavery, right? And a robust system of humanitarian protection would grant people the way, an easy, transparent way to find protection in whatever country that they're in. Mintu, do you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, this is a whole nother basket, and there are so many good organizations that are working on trafficking and modern slavery. Did we just lose Guerline? Okay.
No. I'm doing some background stuff. You keep going.
Okay, great. I mean, I just encourage you all to look at actually the Freedom Fund, which is a really wonderful organization run by a good friend of mine. Tries to essentially raise money that then is donated to frontline workers in India, in Bangladesh, and so many countries to try to get at and save people from modern slavery. It is a major human rights issue right now, and there's some just amazing organizations. There's a global partnership against modern slavery and that sort of thing as well. But human rights is both an idea that we have to deal with at a very human level. How do you treat other people, even within your own family? Do you respect them? How do you talk to them? Do you listen to them? all the way to sort of the global level. So to Bilal's point, the UN, and our diplomatic corps in the US government has to go to these international organizations to try to create the norms and support the norms and ideals and principles, and then codify those into resolutions that then governments are supposed to then try to uphold. But it is an ongoing fight. And in fact, over the last few years, we've seen a real backsliding. That human rights language has been removed from a lot of UN documents, in part because the authoritarian governments around the world are saying, you know what, human rights is kind of a nuisance to us. We're getting a bad rep, so let's just remove these things. And so we really, who we vote for, I mean, voting is not, as Maria said, the only thing, but call your member of Congress, donate to those organizations that you really care about. We just had Giving Tuesday. On Giving Tuesday, I always try to donate to an international organization, a national organization, and then something really local, like, the groups that are represented here, because we really have to think about these things in a multi-layered approach, and then also in just how we listen and treat one another.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our panelists, Guerline, Bilal, Mintu, Asha, Nicolaine, overcoming every challenge to be here, be present, and be such amazing panelists in this conversation. At this time, there's a lot of questions about what can we do. And if you've been following that, there's this fantastic fellow in the chat, Robert Keston, who talked to us about the work you're doing and how people can be involved with that locally here in Westchester County.
Thank you. It's not what I'm doing locally, it's what people in the community have asked for locally. It is definitely the offspring of many interested parties. But what we're doing here is we're creating Westchester as a human rights county. And what that is using the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a foundation and a pathway to develop an assembly of nonprofits, businesses, and individuals coming together as equals around the same table to hold government accountable and to make themselves aware and knowledgeable about what's in the Universal Declaration. The only way any of this stuff works is if we all know what our inalienable rights are. If we don't know them, we don't have them. And a local assembly, that's primary goal is to make sure that every one of the 1 million people that live in Westchester County know and can claim their rights as their own, will be a huge first step. Because then we won't look at elected officials as leaders, but we will look at them as representatives. And we are the leaders of our communities. And that is why it is certainly more than voting. It is our responsibility, and it is a article in the Declaration that says we have responsibilities to the community. And that is essential if we are to have the kind of world we want to live in. So starting next year, we will be doing what we call a human rights integration learning process. We have already had 4 or 5 Zooms introducing people to the concept of a human rights county, which is an outgrowth of our organization's work in getting the UN to carry out the UN Decade of Human Rights Education that ran from 1995 to 2004. And from that, we developed the Human Rights Cities program, which has a variety of cities in different parts of the world. And now it's time, as the United States falls into a very divisive period in history, to start organizing these kinds of communities within the United States. We're working in Westchester on St. Louis as a human rights city, and others in and across the United States. So this is a massive effort. Along with what Min said, it's invaluable in terms of saving our democracy. If there is no democracy, there will be no efforts to save the environment or women's rights or LGBTQ or any of the other kinds of things that we hold dear. This is the big picture. This is where we have to come together and let our silos down, and we have to work with each other as much as possible for the common good. And a human rights county will allow for that to happen, where all the organizations can come together once again as equals, reflecting those who have self-selected them to meet their needs. Unlike elected officials who are elected by a part of the population, a Human Rights Assembly is one that pulls together the organizations and institutions that the public has selected as their representative. It gives them a chance to freely voice their concerns and get them addressed. And so it's a unique situation that has worked well in different parts of the world. We're hoping that it will work well here. And the timeliness is, well, we're running out of time. We know that there's a certain amount of time to save the environment, but the alarm bells have already sounded off on saving our democracy. And democracy is the cornerstone for us to be able to do and to have the freedoms that we want. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was the world's response to the Holocaust and World War II. And it is and framework for how we can live in a complex society, even with people we vehemently disagree with. It gives us the language for communication, and it gives us the language so that we can move forward. And I hope you'll join us. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you so much, Robert. It was really important as we discussed so many heavy and different things that we had the opportunity to hear from you and hear about the work that's happening here to make Westchester a human rights county. So